Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to the Post 80. Alexandra Kollontai, Life, Politics, Loneliness and Struggle. This post has been 8 months in the making. I've been gathering material from around the world, and in fact, the last book arrived for me a week before I was writing this post. So this is significant, this is meaningful for us at this time. Those of you that have come in late, hello to all our new subscribers. You are amazing humans. And what we've started to do is whenever we reach a zero post, so 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, we summon somebody who perhaps has been a bit forgotten in time, but speaks with a language and an accent that is bespoke and important to us now. And so before I get into the personal and professional reasons why we are here and exploring Alexandra Kollontai, let me talk a little bit about the political context around us at the moment. Now, in the last 2 years, a whole series of very inelegant words and phrases have been used by some very inelegant people. So woke, libtard, the crazy left, those commies, snowflake, PC, better, and the blue pill. Now, these words, these phrases serve particular functions in right-wing populism, but one of the functions that it activates is to silence alternatives, silence resistance. The point of these words is to demonize an enemy within. And the response to this desire to frighten, to fracture, to marginalise and to demean is why I thought this is the moment in the Post 80 to talk about an actual communist, an actual Marxist feminist, an actual revolutionary. So what I'm trying to do is stop all this inelegant, grotesque language being used at people who are just being sort of nice and compassionate and caring for other humans. They're not the loony left, they're just nice humans. So therefore, in respite and in response to that, let's talk about an actual communist, and there are plenty of actual communists from which I could choose. But I'm trying to provide a space to show you what this looks like, to configure a space outside of right-wing populism and the language they use to demonise the enemy within. But there are also professional and personal reasons that we are here, and this post goes into difficult issues. As you know, I don't balk or move away from issues and topics and problems that don't sort of fit the template of our time. And as many of you may know, my first couple of degrees were in European history, and Russian and then Soviet and then Russian history again was integral to how I was taught at that time. And I had the great privilege of Russian, Soviet specialist historians teaching me during that period, and it's a privilege I never took for granted, because the Russian, Soviet, Russian lens on European history is very distinctive and very important. Now, my first year European history course was organised so that a different nation of Europe would be focused on every single month, and a featured historian would appear in that particular month. So of course there was a Russian, Soviet, Russian month, and the historian was Isaac Ducher, whose incredible biography of Stalin, Working Through the Purges, was 686 pages in length, still one of the greatest books ever written. But there was also this amazing sort of cultural infusion that existed during this month, and we were reading sort of popular cultural books of the time, and the focus on popular culture in that Russian Soviet week was of course Alexandra Kollontai. Now, I was 18 years old when I read Love. And I know, looking at this hallowed shell of a woman that you're looking at there, you're going, could this woman have ever been 18? Well, yes, I was. And I was transformed when I read her novel, Red Love, and read her essays and her speeches. And I was inspired and I was amazed like only an 18-year-old girl can be. And I was stunned really about this outspoken and confident woman. Now, all these decades later, I've never forgotten the impact of that remarkable woman on my younger self. But the weird thing is, particularly through my life, I mean, she's been increasingly forgotten. Many of you have probably never heard of the name Alexandra Kollontai. And I think she is an uncomfortable reminder in our culture of a failed Marxism. She's also an uncomfortable reminder of the millions upon millions upon millions of deaths that happened during Stalin's purges. She did have some moments of revisioning and returning to culture in the 1970s, but it is tough to find all these books and articles that I've found beyond the remarkable online archives. And in the last 8 months, I've gathered up all these quirky little interesting books, a great big pile of these little tiny books that have been published and indeed printed on demand from these little tiny publishers around the world, from India, from Finland, from Armenia, from Algeria. It's been an amazing education in international publishing as well, can I say. And we've got this little tiny publishing industry encircling this woman who has been forgotten by time. So what makes this woman and her words important and dangerous to such an extent that she must be marginalised from time, from our time? What makes this difficult woman who suffered so much important for our time, our lives, and our writing? Right, well, let's do this. Let's find out. So all I'm going to do today is take her entire career and cluster it around 5 ideas for you to consider in our present. I'm presenting these not for you to agree with them or disagree with them, but just take these ideas for a walk in our current time. So who is this woman? Well, Alexandra Kollontai, born in 1872, died in 1952, born in Russia. She was a prolific communist writer who just sort of happened to be a woman. She spent her life fighting for women's rights as part of the Russian Revolution and the subsequent decades. She was a people's commissar, and that's the equivalent of a cabinet secretary. She just happened to be a cabinet secretary in 1917. She was an ambassador in 1923, 50 years before the Margaret Thatchers, the Indira Gandhis. She was outspoken and she was fearless, and they're very interesting and pretty easy words to use. They're pretty challenging words to use during the Stalinist purges. She served her country even while she was in unofficial exile during the premiership of Joe Stalin. She was appointed the Soviet ambassador to Norway in 1923. She was the world's first ambassador in modern times. She then became the ambassador of Mexico and Sweden. She was also a member of the Soviet delegation that went to the League of Nations. She was a remarkable writer. She moved from speeches to polemics to essays, high theory essays, and also to fiction, particularly Soviet romance fiction. And she wrote in multiple languages. And she was a brilliant speaker. She was able to shape and transform a crowd. So she was a revolutionary, she was a politician, she was a diplomat, she was a speaker, she was a writer, she was a theoretician. A pretty astounding life, but also a forgotten life. The remarkable Sheila Rowbotham stated, as much of communism in the 1920s has been parked and forgotten, it's been, quote, buried so deeply in the dustbins of history that their rediscovery becomes major salvaging work, end of quote. From what I've done in the last 8 months, I would absolutely agree with her. There was the Soviet reinterpretation of the 1920s through both Trotsky and Stalin, and then you've got the non-Russian interpretations of the Soviet 1920s from the perspective of the Cold War, and then you've got the Russian Gorbachev, post-Gorbachev reinterpretations of the Soviet Union in the 1920s. So you've got all these highly ideological refashionings of what happened in the 1920s. It's a great historiographical puzzle. The fortune for Kollontai, I think, is even though Stalin destroyed or hid her writing, just parked it, got rid of it, burnt it, most of her publications have survived in some form through all these weird little books because she wrote in multiple languages. So all these interesting little publishers have found these essays and been able to republish them. But let's, now that we've got a sense of who she is and the strangeness of her active forgetting, let's now move to just 5 issues for you to consider in your life and your work today that Alexandra Kollontai led us to. So let's see if we can continue these ideas or they need to end with her. Let's go for it. So my first area for us to think about is her exploration of the theoretical unity between communism and feminism, class and gender. So we live in a time of atomized identity politics. What this means is an individual has an experience in their life and they narrativize that experience and render it political. This modality of identity politics emerged in the 1960s through progressivist politics, through the civil rights movement, and activated remarkable change. But what's happened since the 1960s is that identity has continued to be salami sliced. So what's happening is identity is now being cut up into smaller and smaller and smaller categories. And these categories and these labels, self-imposed labels, are being held onto with incredible confidence. And that confidence is being used to exclude the building of coalitions, partnerships, and collaborations. And those partnerships exist and have existed in history with all sorts of different groups so that those groups together can fight for wider social, cultural, economic change. And this is why, because we haven't done this, because of this salami slicing of identity, this is why we have today, and following on from the great work of Steve Hall and Simon Winlow, the rise of the right. Let me explain. What we've got at the moment is a large number of angry white working class men who are not in stable work, and they are aligning with extreme right-wing populist movements. So these right-wing extreme populist movements are blaming migrants, foreigners, women, disabled people, academics, the rainbow community, and of course, the loony left. And the reason that white working class men no longer in work are doing this, are creating this blame and marginalisation culture, is because their lives are a disappointment. Their lives are dreadful. They live their lives in despair. Now, firstly, I respect that diagnostic of their own lives. They are right. Their lives are a disappointment. And as has been shown by Case and Deaton's remarkable research in their book and related articles, Deaths of Despair, white working class people are drinking themselves to death, losing themselves in oxy addictions, and committing suicide at rates much higher than other groups in the United States. So this is a real problem. This is true. this is real. But instead of understanding what is happening to white working class men that are no longer required in large numbers in industry and are being educated at a lower level than women in their peer group and class, the focus now is on blaming foreigners. And those foreigners may be from China, they may be from Denmark, they may be from Canada, they may be from Mexico. The blaming of women for not being like their mothers, and blaming the enemy within, that is immigrants, who are supposedly taking white working class men's jobs. So yes, white working class men are in trouble, but those troubles were not created by an enemy within. And because of this salami slicing of identity politics, the capacity to build those relationships, build those partnerships, to create a wide-ranging social change, all those possibilities are lost. And we're losing ourselves in blame and shame and fear and anger and rage. Now, Alexandra Kollontai was different. She was a feminist and fought for women's rights, but she always fought for women's rights as part of the class struggle. She realised and stressed that women are part of the working class, and the class struggle is the most important part of life if you're interested in creating justice and equality. Class struggle is it. The fight for women's rights is part of working class rights, fighting for the class struggle. And it's not decentering the class struggle, it's not taking energy from it. She demonstrated and she built theoretical and political connections and affinities between class and gender. Cool. In 1906, she wrote a great essay, The Basis of the Woman Question. And she focused, theoretical piece, focusing on how feminism interfaces with Marxism. And we remember, I think, that in the October 1917 revolution, women were at the barricades. And by 1918, the first all-Russian conference of proletariat and peasant women was held. So the focus at this time, with the support of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, was the building of new forms of human relationships. Who does the housework? How do people and property align? These debates at the time were incredibly complex. And look, there was a general consensus, the building of consensus, a general consensus from men that the education of women was important and birth control for women was important. That's great, important. But as Sheila Rowbotham has argued, quote, Bolsheviks under the bedsheets, end of quote, was a little bit more complex to organise. So what family relationships, what sexual relationships were appropriate after the proletarian revolution? Women were politically confident and they were gaining consciousness. Remember, we're at 1918 here. The world is at war and the class struggle was continuing in kitchens and in bedrooms. This was a different type of revolution. This was an intimate revolution. So Lenin supported Kollontai through these discussions. He realised the consequences of this old bourgeois morality and what that morality does to our understanding of work and class and consciousness. And all sorts of new boundaries were being discussed and being implemented. The goal was the liberation of personal relationships. So all of this discussion really was based on a single question. Can the working class be emancipated without the emancipation of women? And that was Kollontai's question, and that was her problem. And she sat in discomfort and she stayed in that discomfort. So no area of lived experience was too intimate or too personal. All of life required a re-evaluation. And can I say, when I'm rereading her work all these decades later, I was shocked. I wasn't as shocked when I was 18, interestingly enough, but I was shocked at her candour. I was shocked at her honesty, and it was really quite uncomfortable in the 2020s to be reading these ideas. What about 1918? So personal, so intimate, so powerful, and yes, so political. But she continued to work hard, often as the lone voice, doing the hard yakka, trying to connect communism with feminism, building community, building partnerships. The liberation of women was part of the liberation of the working class. So these projects were tethered and remain tethered. So whoever in our present uses a singular atomized identity label to attack other groups and other people, undermining their rights about who they are, we need to remember that there is another way. Remember Alexandra Kollontai. 2. Kollontai was powerfully international. Kollontai built relationships with women around the world, including deep friendships with Rosa Luxemburg and Clara Zetkin. But she was particularly interested in research, in international research, and she researched maternity legislation around the world and the physical and the psychological impacts of motherhood, and that was well represented in her 1915 book, Society and Motherhood. And can I say, she also supported the women who joined Congress for the first time from Turkestan as they removed their veils for the first time and entered Congress, supporting the diversity of women. And she made sure in her essays that were published in 1927 about the October Revolution to provide tethers and connections with the women of the West. And she used the phrase a lot, new women. She talked a lot about new women and how to create life and work for new women beyond the private family economy. So these issues, these commitments were shared by Lenin. I read Lenin's work from the period, and particularly in 1918, they had a very strong shared alignment about ideas. And remember, Lenin wrote with Kollontai. Whenever you're wondering, what was the relationship between them? They wrote together, and Lenin didn't write with many people. And they wrote together on the importance of women's rights. One of the earliest pieces of legislation that was passed after the October Revolution was to make divorce easier, so that women could leave an unhappy, violent, brutalising marriage. And that legislation was in place on December 18, 1917. So Lenin wrote about International Women's Day, noting Kollontai's leadership in enabling International Women's Day and the importance of women in democracy. Lenin argued that we need women's liberation as it renders democracy, quote, of breadth and depth, end of quote. Now, there were profound disagreements between Kollontai and Lenin, hashtag understatement. It was particularly about the scale of bureaucracy that was occurring from the Bolshevik Revolution. So Kollontai was very much in favour of the People's Revolution, so a disintermediated situation, whereas, as we all know, with the Kulak class, Lenin, through his governments, the bureaucracy increased. So separating the politicians from the people they were representing, and Kollontai was against that. But obviously Kollontai had even more substantive disagreements with Stalin, and he threatened, and in fact he had a really good go at trying to expel her from the party, but she survived to continue her international diplomatic work. So this was an exile from Russia of a different kind. But we need to note her profound successes in that sphere as well. As the Soviet ambassador to Norway and Sweden, she was the first woman to hold these roles. But you see, the success from Kollontai was not just simply being the first. We talk about the first woman that did this. It wasn't really that. What happened was she normalised the commercial relations between Norway and the Soviet Union by 1925. She enabled and led a trade delegation to Mexico in 1926, and of course was involved in the League of Nations. Great. So while we sort of focus on her domestic innovation as the People's Commissar for Social Welfare, and we need to, because she focused on eliminating illiteracy, working on gender equality, attention to divorce, collectivising laundries and kitchens and childcare, to free women up to participate in political life. The story is much more complex, and also it's much more international. Many of the histories and the tributes to her leave out Stalin and leave out the purges, and we must not do that. But we do have to try and understand how she survived the purges, right? So she, along with Muranov, so Stalin had a BFF, Muranov, he survived the purges, obviously, but the only other person who was there in 1917 and survived the purges was Kollontai. So the other revolutionaries who fought with Lenin did not survive. So how did she do it? Well, she did it by staying away from Russia during this period. But we need to note that both her husband and her lover were killed. But when she died in 1952, she had no sense at all about her international influence and impact. But whenever we discuss International Women's Day, we need to remember that it was started by Kollontai in Russia in 1913. Other nations have always had sort of a day for women, but she, with Zetkin and Luxembourg, were able to unify and create an International Women's Day. And that is a profound international legacy. 3. She followed her arguments through and was prepared to be wrong. Kollontai was focused on women being economically independent of men, and was trying to move relationships between men and women beyond dependence and fear and insecurity. But she was also incredibly practical about how this social change was going to take place. She believed that women should be liberated from housework. And she argued, incredibly radically I would argue, that the domestic revolution was also part of the wider revolution. And without the domestic revolution, the subordination of women would continue. Now, she was following on there for Marx and Engels, particularly Engels' work, where Engels critiqued the role of the family in capitalist society, particularly the nuclear family. And Kollontai proposed concrete strategies to remove the domestic burden from women. So state-run canteens to provide food for everybody rather than individual women at home cooking individual meals. She was in favour of low rent communal apartments, free public education from early childhood, and she focused very strongly and radically on the rights of the child, the rights that exist in childhood. She was absolutely brilliant on domestic slavery, the importance of economic independence, maternal rights, and argued that the decision to become a mother must be undertaken freely with contraception available so that decision can be undertaken freely. So it's very easy, I think, to diagnose the injustices of women, but Kollontai constructed very clear and workable solutions to these problems. And Kollontai questioned the very nature of love and sex and womanhood by 1921. She stated that, quote, family and marriage are historical categories, end of quote, 1921. She was developing strategies for housework, domestic work in particular, and I love this, and it just blows your head off. She was trying to come up with strategies about how domestic work could be integrated into the national economy. She argued that these small domestic economies were deeply inefficient, and she made the case that women have the right to have what she described as productive labour. We'll get to my critique in a second on that. But can I say, this is where I think she took a misstep. It's not appropriate, I would argue, to disrespect the cooking, the cleaning, the caring duties that exist in a society. As shown through COVID and indeed through our daily lives, these caring duties, this caring infrastructure is absolutely crucial to who we are as humans. And it is important to value all work, the work of care, the work of carers. So I think, that was a mistake that she made. But she was a great believer in the freedom of children and children's rights. And her views on children's rights, the rights of the child, are incredibly radical even to this day. And her writing on sexual relationships and the class struggle, again from 1921, affirmed the importance of joyful sexual relationships. That's her word, by the way, the importance of joyful sexual relationships. And she argued that sexual issues are not private issues. And she affirmed, she created a taxonomy of the diversity of personal relationships: marriage, free unions, secret adultery, women living with their partner, pair marriage, or marriage in threes and fours. She did this in 1921. She was brilliant on how we live a life after a revolution. She explored love as a social construct and asked, what sort of relationships do we need to create a classless and a happier society? She was prepared to align theory and politics, but she was also prepared to be wrong. 4. Kollontai knew that disempowered groups use disempowered sites to renegotiate their social positions. Now, I've just restated the argument from my second book, Ladies Who Lunch, where I argued that disempowered groups use disempowered sites to renegotiate their social relationships. Now, Kollontai knew this, and you could see this through her essays, through her pamphlets, through her speeches. But remember, she also wrote stories. She wrote fiction. And very easily, the fiction that she wrote could be configured in the romance fiction genre. Her book, Free Love, that was translated into English as Red Love, was about women's feelings before and after the revolution. In Love of the Worker Bees, great book, a woman, Vasilia, loved a man. Loved a man. It's like a country song. Loved a man. But this man betrayed her, and even worse, betrayed her with a class traitor. Now, Vasilis leaves him, describing the process of leaving this nasty man as, quote, removing a skin that did not fit me, end of quote. So she found new freedom in economic independence, a community of women through a different type of attachment, a separation from men. That was the happy ending. Okay, now reading it again, this book has a great sort of Daniel Steele effect to it. It has a lot of the sort of tropes of a woman of substance, to be honest with you. A woman who suffered, and then the man did her wrong, and she then gained the courage to leave him and rebuild her life. Great. So Kollontai chose the lowest genre of fiction, chose a romance novel, okay, and created new ways of living through it in a genre that has been discredited by so many. Kollontai found the good in this low genre and built the revolution through it. She used fiction to paint the picture of women's lives before and after the Bolshevik Revolution. And she intentionally went into people's lives, into their fears, into their hopes. And when she wrote Love of the Worker Bees, It found a wide audience, and she intended to do that. And if you notice when you read it, the sentences are very short, the vocabulary is very simple and straightforward, so that people who don't normally read could read it. But she deployed the great slogan in many ways that I've used in my life, my political life, but also in my educational life, which is talk to people where they are rather than where you want them to be. And of course, 5, here we go. The focus on loneliness. Upon rereading her entire career, fiction and non-fiction, the speeches, the essays, it's tragic and deeply tragic. It touched me incredibly deeply to see how frequently she wrote about loneliness. This was a personal loneliness. She had very complicated relationships with men, including her own son. But as early as 1921, she wrote about, quote, the heavy hand of the unavoidable loneliness of the spirit, end of quote. She asked, what does love mean? What does love look like when it's based on equality and freedom? This was not abstract for her. In 1921, she wrote, quote, a person wants to escape from his loneliness and naively imagines that being in love gives him the right to the soul of another person. End of quote. In her writing, in her fiction, in her non-fiction, the bundling up of love and sex and fidelity and infidelity, companionship and loneliness, all of this is integral to her work. And she spent much of her life thinking about the different modes of friendship and relationships to manage this loneliness of spirit. And I'm not sure she succeeded in resolving that, even in her own mind. Therefore, look, I want to finish our post 80, and thank you for being with me through these 80 sessions. Unbelievable, you are amazing. But I wanted to finish this 80th post in wonderment, really. Wondering how the first woman in the world in modern times to be part of a government, how this woman can be so easily lost to us. Part of it, I think, is that communism and socialism just can't be mentioned anymore without abuse. You mention it anywhere and the pile-on online is just catastrophic. And look, part of it is also about the work of Lenin and how the work of Lenin has simply been lost through the darkness of the Stalinist purges. And I understand that. But the weird thing is that Kollontai is undermentioned in Marxism and undermentioned in feminism, and she spent a life trying to link them together. But to summon that old cliche, I think we really are throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And can I say that's a cliche I very rarely use. But Alexandra Kollontai did so much that we value now. She linked up theory and practice, ways of thinking with activism. It is important, I think, that we acknowledge her errors, her disrespect for caring work, the cleaning, the cooking, the caring for other human beings. That was wrong. She must not dismiss that. That is important work in a culture. She was also wrong in her treatment of sex workers. Her attacks on prostitution are probably understandable in terms of the wider critique of bourgeois culture, but it didn't respect these women as workers. And the lack of respect for sex workers as humans was a problem. But Stalin could not have her in his government. You see, her very presence, like one of the few women, her very presence confirmed how far he had moved away from Lenin, how far he had moved away from believing in equality for women. So to survive the purges, she had to leave Russia for the most of his leadership, really, and focus on diplomacy rather than writing policy. But her capacity to question intimate sexual relationships, to render them just and equal and meaningful, is so inspiring. Now, male Marxists have been able to accept and celebrate Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin, and of course they were Kollontai's close friends. But Alexandra Kollontai is just too much for most Marxist scholars. And they've ignored her, like Stalin ignored her. And that's because one of the reasons I think, having read this all again, is because she survived the purges. Now, Muranov survived the purges, Stalin's BFF. She was the only other person there at 1917 who survived. And it was sort of like, well, how did she survive? And that's undermined her credibility. But her movement into the diplomatic corps was a way to silence and marginalise her. But ironically, this component of her life through diplomacy has been really underwritten and shows her capacity to internationalise her views. This diplomatic period resulted in her being nominated for 2 Nobel Peace Prizes in 1946 and 1947 for brokering that Finnish-Soviet ceasefire. We need to remember she was the Soviet ambassador to Sweden during the Second World War. And for those of you that know anything about the Soviet Union and the Scandinavian nations and the complexity of those relationships during the Second World War, you can see how remarkable Kollontai was. Now, of course, most of her domestic work was unravelled by 1930. Stalin had removed much of the legislation that she wrote. But she was a survivor, and there was a cost to that survival. She's been ignored because supposedly she focused on minor issues like families, like intimacy, like love, like sex. She explored the many types of work in our lives, and her incredible analysis has great resonance in our present. You see, she got inside the double burden of women's lives and found strategies to disconnect womanhood and motherhood and womanhood and marriage. Most importantly, she valued women as people, as equal participants in society and an economy. She was attacked and she was undermined in her own lifetime as well, by the way. My favourite critique from 1917 from Pitram Sorokin, who later moved to the United States, surprise, surprise, and he was a sociologist. This was his description of Kollontai, quote, "In spite of her numerous husbands, Kollontai, first the wife of a general, late the mistress of a dozen men, is not yet satisfied. She seeks out new forms of sexual sadism. I wish she might come under the observation of Freud and other psychiatrists. She would indeed be a rare subject for them." End of quote. Now, we've seen all these types of movements recently. Women from Taylor Swift to Kamala Harris. If a woman has ideas that are not respected and not acknowledged, then their bodies, their behaviours, their moralities are sexualised. We can do better. We can do better. We no longer live in 1917. She was seen to be so dangerous during her own lifetime that the United States government deemed her a security risk. And that is the cost of being an agent for change, an advocate of new ways of thinking, of living, and of loving. In the last few pages of her autobiography that was published in 1926 and heavily edited because of Stalin, she stated, quote, "No matter what further tasks I shall be carrying out, it is pretty clear to me that the complete liberation of the working woman and the creation of the foundation of a new sexual morality will always remain the highest activity of my life." End of quote. Now, that was not true. She had successes in the 20s, 30s and 40s. But next time that you hear or see or read online someone abusing a colleague or a friend or a fellow citizen as a loony lefty or commie or woke or a libtard, please remember Alexandra Kollontai, a revolutionary in her own time that has been forgotten in ours. Maybe it's time to bring her back. I wish you love, light and peace. Tia.